Okay, so we're ready to talk about Chapter 5?
2, Note C, right?
Yeah, it's still in actually Note A because we're looking at the notes for Phase 2 Notes A PDF,
Okay.
where it says page 13 to 16.
Okay.
Okay, so we're talking about zoning right now, which is the first one. First topic that you see there. Zoning is obviously authority given by the city. So if we look at the city of Toronto, we look at the city of Mississauga, it's the authority that that city gave you to have a permitted use on a land or have a building structure with standards like setbacks and coverages. So when we talk about a few things, so let's say for zoning, you're allowed to have a single dwelling home on the property you live in now. So you have a house in Mississauga, you're allowed to maybe build a shed in the back. The zoning is already in place for that. Okay. Now, if we look at like a Walmart plaza, it has setbacks and coverage, which means that it has enough amount of space in front of it to allow for the parking and allow for the space for the transition onto the main road. And at the back where the shipping comes in, it has space and transition that's allowed to fit in the sidewalk and maybe some trees and some extra grass area. That would be part of the zoning, okay?
Okay.
We understand that?
Yeah.
So it also regulates signage as well. This applies to both commercial and residential. Also, what you'll have to remember is that when we talked about that legal basement apartment thing, so we talked about the legal basement apartment in Mississauga. So, for example, the legal basement apartment in Mississauga was given to you, say, before 1996. So you have the legal right, the legal authority to run it as a basement apartment. Now, that's a non-conforming use as of today. So 2014, that's not allowed anymore. But if you had created it before 1996 and registered it with the city according to the zoning bylaws back then, you could have grandfathered that bylaw from those years into today because you've grandfathered it. It's now a non-conforming use, but you're still permitted to do it because you have a legal status created from earlier. Okay? Okay, so zoning of amendments, which applies to your diagram on page 13 upper. You'll see that the Committee of Adjustments will do all the zoning amendments that are not permitted by the zoning bylaw at the moment, but you want to amend a bylaw and you want to ask for an exception, you'll have to make a application for minor variance, which will allow you to deal with that matter only through the Committee of Adjustment. That's who you're going to for it, okay? Now we'll look at site plan control. So when you have a site development plan, at this point, you're going to obviously design it. You're going to set out to prove that the zoning bylaws in place allow that site plan to be functional. So the site plan controls all the structures within a city. So a site plan that's created for, like, say, Square One area in Mississauga, you would understand that they've controlled the area that's designated for Sheridan College. They've designated an area for the movie theater. They've designated an area for the Celebration Square, where people get together for any city events. So all of that's applies commercial and also in residential because it also applies to single family homes as well. They have site plans, which we also look at kind of like a registered subdivision. So once you have a registered subdivision, like in an area that you live in right now, that originally had a site plan. Like a site plan is registered with the city. Like we can always look it up and say, oh yeah, the zoning for this home that OREA lives in is a single family home. That's what the zoning is. So it's not allowing you to start a boarding house. It's not allowing you to start a bed and breakfast in there. That kind of thing, right? It's showing you that you're excluded from certain items that are not allowed in the zoning bylaw. Okay. Now the building code is set out. So they set out construction standards for both residential and commercial. So there's certain types of sizes of wood or thickness of wall or thickness of fireproof doors or type of fireproof doors that can be on the front door, the back door, the type of garage you can use. So there's minimum materials of standards that you're supposed to use according to the building code. And that's for construction companies when they're building a new home or renovating a new home or also rebuilding a home that's been burned down from a fire accident or from a flood or whatever the case is where the insurance has paid you back the money. Okay? So now you also have a fire code. So the interior building code was the first thing that's according to construction standards. The second thing is a fire code, which is in regulation to preventing and retaining a fire if it were to happen in a home. So it's trying to control, like the fire code is allowing you certain provisions inside the home to make sure that if a fire does occur that it won't start exploding like crazy. Okay. Right? They don't want you to have an oil tank in the basement.
So they just build it in a way to avoid it.
Yeah, they're trying to build it as smart as possible. They want to use certain safety standards and avoid certain hazards that would come into play, and that would cause an amplified fire, which we don't
Okay.
want, right? So that's what the interior building code is. It also coverages the sewage systems of construction. So like when you see the guys on the street ripping up the ground and putting in new sewers, like you see it all the time when we have road construction. They do that. That is part of the interior building code. So the building inspectors that are allotted by the city, they're going to go and make sure there's no code violations. So there's people in charge to go make sure that's going to happen. Okay. Now, when a construction company builds a new home, for example, there will be a legal permission to start construction, and then there'll be something called an occupancy permit, which a building inspector will go into. He'll check everything. He'll make sure all the building codes are good. He'll be satisfied. He'll issue an occupancy permit, which will allow the person who bought the home to move in. Okay. And so fire code is also known as the interior fire code. It's the one and the same thing. It applies to commercial and residential, like I said. So it's all about fire safety. There is somebody who's in charge of all the responsibilities and protecting it. So basically the head person who's in charge of in the city would be the fire marshal. So if there's a fire marshal in Mississauga, he can open up an investigation. He can call it. He can close the case. He can do an inspection. He can do enforcements. He can impose a recovery cost on somebody. He can do all sorts of things. He's got a lot of power. Almost like he's kind of like a police officer in a way, and he's a combination of like a small claims court in a way. He can impose things and also enforce the law. Okay. So now there's fire classifications which you can memorize. This is very simple. It's A, B, C, and D. The first one will tell you which one burns easily, like paper, wood, plastic. That can be extinguished with water, so you can remember that. Class B would be like grease or flammable items, and that can be extinguished with a blanket or a foam or a form of a blanket cover of any type. Okay. C would be a mechanical, electrical fire. You can usually extinguish this with water. Water would actually make it worse because you can cause electrical impact. So you might want to use some kind of like powder, kind of like a fire extinguisher would be the best thing because it contains that white powder. That would actually control it. Class D is just says it says combustible metal. It doesn't actually say how to deal with it. So we don't obviously have to deal with that answer in the exam. Okay, so we don't have to really worry about that at this point. How to make a basement apartment and accessory apartment legal. We've kind of covered this. So obviously you need to have the zoning bylaw permit. So you in certain cities you had to have the basement built before 1996. It has to meet the fire code and electrical standards. So the inspector who comes in, the fire marshal, has to give you a certificate to say that it is clear and it is good and it meets the ground level of all of the circuit breakers and grounded outlets are all safe. So he's got to make sure everything looks good. Okay. There should be a fire-resistant door, which is separate, and it should.
Would the fire code be the first thing that they go through, versus like building codes?
Well, let's say that the building code really only applies if it's being built. So if it's not currently under construction, you don't really need to look at the building code so much right now, because at the time it was constructed, the building code was enforced. Right.
Okay.
So it's like you building a car. You enforce the vehicle, building codes when it's being built, not later, because it's already built. So at this point, with this scenario, you're really just concerned with the interior fire code because you just want to make sure that if you want to maintain your status for a legal basement apartment, the fire code has to be always maintained.
Right.
So if they came for an inspection even like 20 years later, and that's because somebody else is buying the house, but it was built in 1996, fire code still has to be up to date. So that doesn't change. Okay. There's a few differences here in these notes on page 14's bottom. It says that the building code versus fire code just gives you a little bit of differentiation between the two. They're obviously not the same. I've kind of already explained the differences in what it is. The fire code regulates fire safety in existing structures, including basements. That's exactly what the fire code is doing. The building code applies to new construction, but also alterations too. So what if you took the back of your house and ripped the wall out and wanted to extend the house back a few feet, build an extension? The interior building code will come into play again.
Okay.
Right? Okay. And also if you do any existing changes, that can also obviously be a part of it at that time. Okay, so now we've got smoke alarms. We know these are part of the fire code. They have to be installed in all the sleeping areas is what it says. So if you read the last line, it kind of confirms to you what it should be. It should be audible. It should sound an alarm within the room or the suite. The bottom line says that the smoke alarms must be installed outside all sleeping areas. So that's the key in this scenario. Okay, so now there's water courses that run along our areas of cities and municipalities. Now we have water courses are basically floodplains and wetlands. Okay, so I'm gonna have to help you with a mental picture on both of them. Floodplains are basically, have you ever seen a river running in a park?
Mm-hmm.
Right, you see how there's a little bit of curve and the water's running and they've got a little bit of like mud on the sides.
Yeah.
And it's controlling the level of water to flow within. Okay, that's
Okay.
kind of like what a floodplain is. And a wetland is basically where you see swampy water and you see grass kind of growing out of the water and you see ducks floating around. That's a wetland. And we see those commonly in Ontario in a lot of our cottage areas too. But we actually have this in lots of parts of Mississauga. You'll see both of these types of things. Now the floodplains have different versions. So that description I described to you, there's a river running in a park and it has a little bit of mud, a little mud fringe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that fringe is containing the water within that area so it doesn't overflow. So there is certain fringes that are much larger. They'll be way larger and they'll contain the water in case it rains heavily and in case the water level goes up. It won't allow it to overflow. Okay, so let's look at the floodplain. So the first zone is where development is absolutely prohibited. There is no development allowed on that land. That would be kind of like any park you can think of. There's some parks near Square One and they have water running through them. You can't construct there and you never will be able to. They won't allow it. Okay, so if you go to certain parts of Oakville, they have rivers running in the back of certain areas and through the parks. You can never construct near that river because that land is not stable enough. Okay.
Okay.
So the second zone is conditional development. So if we look at, I don't know if you know Humber River Hospital. Humber River Hospital is a hospital that's built on the hill, and there's a huge river running beside it. Now the floodplain height is really tremendously high. You'll see these great little like slopes going in like this, and the river's at the bottom. So that is a second zone floodplain. Okay. That basically allows you to construct it near it because there's so much space and the water is kind of in a triangle at the bottom so that it doesn't really allow it to overflow. It doesn't allow the land to be weak. It doesn't allow a lot of things related to constructing near it, whereas the other one is much more sensitive to it, so you can actually construct near it. Okay. So that's exactly what those two are. And there's actually a little mini diagram that's on this page of page 15 that kind of describes that. Okay, in the middle. Okay, so wetlands are established. It's about 2 meters deep in maximum. That's what a wetland is. So you'll see those ducks floating around. They're in little areas. Sorry, excuse me. You find them in certain little areas. You'll probably see them a lot in even near the Port Credit area. So in the Port Credit area, there's little mini rivers that connect to the actual water bodies, and you'll see ducks floating around there, and you'll see little grass kind of like rising up in the water. You'll see more of this in the cottage country, though. Wetlands are more popular there. You'll also see them in certain parts of like Markham in Unionville. If you've ever been in Markham, they have particularly a wetland area park, and people come there just to see the ducks and all that sort of thing. Okay. So it's a maximum of 2 meters deep, so you can remember that point. That's important to remember. It's usually by shallow water, and it's sometimes near a water table or near the surface. Okay, so now from there we look into riparian rights. This is when you are living on the water yourself. You own a home, and you are maybe living on the lake. Your home is backing up onto the water that you might go boating or swimming in. So these rights are of an owner that is on the banks of a water course and takes advantage of the water. That's exactly what it says here, so you get to enjoy it. It says for you to note and understand that the Act stipulates, so there's a Ontario Water Resources Act, that any owner taking or transferring 50,000 liters of water a day must take a special permit from the ministry. So if you're backing onto Lake Ontario, that's great and well. But if you start taking over 50,000 liters of water a day to do whatever you're doing with it, you better be speaking to the Ministry of Environment for a special permit. All right. Otherwise, they'll turn into a very hefty fine and could be leading into other legal issues. So, environmental controls. This is where a lot of real estate transactions come into play, and you have to look at the comprehensive regulations of environment. So, you can look at, there's basically environmental audits. There's a phase 1, 2, and 3, kind of like what we're doing with our real estate courses. These are usually for commercial transactions. This is where you have a concern to check the soil and to see if it's clean. Usually applies to land where there's a gas station. Okay? So if you have a gas station, sometimes the oil will leak from the top into the land in the bottom. So the oil or the petrol will leak into the soil, which will contaminate it, and which will contaminate it into the water flow in the bottom. Okay? So let's say you buy a gas station and you want to break it down and you want to build a Tim Hortons on top. You'll have to do an environmental, probably phase 1, 2, and 3. First phase, they'll check the land, assess it, give you a report. 2, they'll do soil tests, and 3, they'll have to do cleanup. So they'll have to dig up a certain amount of dirt, take it out, remove it, send it where it has to go, and put brand new, refined dirt that can basically uphold the structure that you're going to build on top and clean it out. Okay, that's what you're doing with an environmental in simple English. It always applies to very heavily, obviously, to gas stations or things that have chemical liquids moving over and above beyond it. Because gas stations have containers at the bottom, as you know, right, underneath them to store the gas so people can pump it, so it can actually leak into the soil very easily. Okay. Now, a green belt is a protected piece of land. Green belt is where you never construct. It stays green forever. It's controlled by the federal government. Greenbelt Act was established in 2005. It's protecting 1.8 million acres, so that's a lot of land. Now this is sensitive agricultural land into the Golden Horseshoe. Golden Horseshoe covers you anywhere from, say, like Trent River, that's Peterborough, all the way to Niagara Falls. That's what the Golden Horseshoe is, what it means. Now, so you have to understand that it also covers the Niagara Escarpment Plain. So that's another thing that it covers. Those are boundaries. It limits your residential and commercial development, and it has a very defined boundary of construction. So it's just like any other protected land by the government. You can only do so much things on it, and you've got to get permission. So they'll have some restrictions on it. The Niagara Escarpment is stretching from Niagara Falls all the way to Bruce, Bruce County? It's the north tip of Georgian Bay. So it actually goes from Niagara Falls to right to Georgian Bay, the north tip of it. So if you look on your map, you can see how Niagara Falls goes this way, and it goes all the way up to the northern side of Georgian Bay. Okay? Okay. And then you've got the Ridges Moraine.
Is that land that you...
That's protected, yeah. It's environmentally significant to the area, so it's protected land, and it has a lot of restrictions. You might be able to do certain things on it, but it's going to have some heavy-duty restrictions on it. Okay. Okay. The Oak Ridges Moraine is, this is where it consists, this is a question actually that came up. It was asking what consists a ridge of sandy hills stretching from Niagara to Trent River, and that was one of the questions, and the answer was the Oak Ridges Moraine. Okay. Again, it's the same idea. It's environmentally sensitive land. It's got a lot of headwaters. It's a lot of streams, and they flow into the GTA. Okay, so that's all in there, and that was a question that you can remember. It also tells you in the line above the diagram, it's got much-needed stone and rock resources to meet urban building growth demands, which is really awesome. So that actually helps us internally to do things by yourselves without even having to look and find that product. Okay? So that's your chapter 5. Any questions?
No.
You're good? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I'm going to just stop the video now. That was about 20 minutes.